hopefully we have with us Sophie. Can you present yourself while I'm introducing you? So, Sophie. So Sophie has a PhD from the University of Sheffield. Her research focuses on 20th century poetry, poets' letters, and literary archives. Every now and then you get research envy while you're introducing someone at a conference. I'm having one of these moments now. She held a British Library Collaborative Doctoral Award, which involved cataloguing emails in the contemporary poet Wendy Coates' archive, one of the first hybrid, part paper, part digital, literary archives acquired by the library. I remember working very briefly at the Poetry Library where they used to hand out a little poem by Wendy Coates about what she wanted to happen to people who photocopied her work without paying a copyright fee. She has published essays on the letters and poems of Elizabeth Bishop, in Reading Elizabeth Bishop, an Edinburgh Companion, and the Review of English Studies. But today, she is going to ask the really pertinent question, out of date rubbishy, rereading Vita Sackville-West's The Land.
I'm just getting my, did you want me to, I've managed to share my slides, I think.
Yeah, we've got them, Sophie.
Great, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you like a good one.
Brilliant. Okay, so hang on, I'll just time myself. So yes, I'm going to be talking about Vita Sackville-West's somewhat maligned poem, the long poem, The Land. I'll just get to my first slide here. So in 1946, Vita Sackville-West wrote the following to her husband, Harold Nicholson, describing her poetry and apparent discordance with the more avant-garde experimental work of other writers of the first half of the 20th century, including T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, and Stephen Spender. In comparison to the modernist, deliberately disjointed style of Eliot's The Waste Land, for example, Sackville-West poetry was seen by contemporary reviewers and critics, and even Sackville-West herself, as backward-looking and traditional, taking inspiration from the classics in its focus on rural themes and use of rhyme. And I won't read the whole quotation here, where she talks about her kind of doubts and worries about her poem, but she says to her husband, I think perhaps it has something to do with my dislike of politics. I mean, just lack of interest in what must always be temporary things. Why then should it make me so unbearably happy to write poetry when I know that it is all out-of-date, rubbishy words that mean nothing at all to Ben's, that's her eldest son's generation? Will it ever mean anything to anyone's generation? I doubt it. And the point of my paper is really to kind of revisit and reread The Land to ask whether actually it chimes very well with our current concerns in relation to its focus on landscape, conservation, and the environment. The lack of concern for what Vita here calls temporary things, and she's referring to people like T.S. Eliot in The Waste Land, and her focus instead on the temporal. So I'm going to be talking about time and the poem's relationship to time. So the continual cycles of death, rebirth, and renewal, which she finds in nature and landscape, particularly Kentish landscape, is, I think, at the heart of the vision she conveys in her poetry. So instead of looking at the temporary, I think she focuses really on the temporal, and sort of actually this concept of deep time really chimes, what Peter was talking about earlier, really chimes with what I'm about to say about and about to argue about Vita Sackville-West's poem, The Land. So I'll just give a brief introduction. Many of you might well know a bit about Vita Sackville-West already. She was born at Knoll House near Sevenoaks in Kent, which is a huge country house, a massive pile of a house, vast, and she was an only child. She was the only daughter of Lionel Edward Sackville-West, later Baron Sackville, and his cousin Victoria Sackville-West. But tragically, as a woman, she was unable to inherit Knoll. So when her father died, it passed to her cousin Eddie in 1928, and she was absolutely devastated and never actually really got over this. She and her diplomat husband, Harold Nicholson, famously renovated and transformed the gardens at Sisinghurst in Kent, which was a ruined Elizabethan manor house and gardens. And this is what she's most famous for, I think, actually really is Sisinghurst and what she did there. But she also wrote poetry and novels, and she herself was desperate to be known actually as a poet, and it's what she cared about most was her poetry and wanting people to read it and appreciate it, which they did, although yes, the criticism was, or the reviews were somewhat mixed, as I'll go into. So the land, her husband, Harold Nicholson, this is a quote from him at the beginning, Vita has an idea of writing a sort of English Georgics, Virgil's Georgics, inspired by a chance remark of J.C. Squires, who's an editor, to the effect that it was odd how people did not write poems about occupations. So this is what set Vita off. She wanted to write a poem about agricultural themes and farming and traditional kind of Kent processes that I'll talk about in a minute. The poem is set in the Weald of Kent, which we've heard a bit about already today, actually. It's over 2,500 lines long, and it follows the seasons. So it starts with the poet saying, "I sing the cycle of my country's year." And as I've said, it records traditional Kentish agricultural occupations and processes, which were already in the late 1920s threatened by mechanisation. So, there's a huge catalogue of amazing things that she goes into detail in this poem about. So beekeeping, woodcraft, sheep shearing, sowing, hazel and harvest, craftsmanship, threshing, ploughing, side making and hop picking are all in this poem and described in detail with care and attention. The poem was popular, it sold well, and it won the Hawthornden Prize in 1927. But other people didn't like it as much, and I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the reasons was its kind of pastoral agricultural theme, and the amount of agricultural detail is somewhat overwhelming when you read the poem. Vita was absolutely determined that the poem be an accurate and nuanced record of the farming processes that she describes. And her son, Nigel Nicholson, who's written a brilliant introduction to one of the editions of the poem that I have, he describes being aged 8 and accompanying Vita on her trips to a farm that she owned near where they lived in Longbarn in Kent, and observing all of these processes like sheep shearing, beekeeping, washing sheep dipping to get rid of the parasites. And she went back to her writing, to her study, and she turned what she'd observed into poetry. She also looked at an encyclopedia of agriculture that she had, and you can kind of trace some of the things that she's writing about back to this encyclopedia. So she wanted to get it right, and the result is at times didactic. But these passages in the poem give it its unique structure and strength, I think, and shape. The carefully observed and lively descriptions of such things as, for example, sheep emerging immediately after having their fleeces shorn, quote, "The clipped sheep staggers astonished from such curt release," are interspersed with more lyrical passages, which are actually marked in italics in the poem, which contain more abstract and personal meditations on nature and mortality. In this way, the poem also tries to mirror closely the experience of country and agricultural life. Hard work and monotony is interspersed with more transcendent moments and the appreciation of the beauty of the landscape, the Kentish landscape specifically, in the changing seasons. Her son, Nigel Nicholson, writes that the swarming detail has a cumulative effect. The poem must be long to permit its full development, to suggest the slow turning of the seasons with their interpenetrating moods, tasks, and moods, and to contrast the mortality of man with self-renewing nature. So essentially, the point of it is that it's long, and it follows the seasons, and it kind of follows the way they change gradually and subtly, which Vita observes. So I've just quickly to show, since this is a Kent map symposium, a quite beautiful, I think, map that I found of the Weald of Kent from the 19th century. it's we've talked about it a little bit already today. It's an area of southeast England between the parallel chalk escarpments of the North and South Downs, and it crosses the counties of Hampshire, Surrey, Sussex, and Kent. And the Weald was what Vita Sackville-West was writing about. Sissinghurst, where she later lived, is kind of in the middle of this map here, above Cranbrook. So I've said that the reviews of the poem were pretty mixed, and it did sell very well and it won prizes, but in terms of the kind of literary establishment or elite of the time, they were not so keen. And in fact, I think actually there's a lot of possibly reverse snobbishness involved, and jealousy, because unlike the sort of more modernist works, even sort of Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf's novel, it sold really well, it sold better. So Virginia Woolf has this pretty amazing quotation about Vita and about her writing. She says, all about her is virginal, savage, patrician, and why she writes, which she does with complete competency and a pen of brass, is a puzzle to me. If I were she, I should merely stride with 11 elk hounds behind me through my ancestral woods. So Virginia Woolf, who famously was Vita's lover, for a while, thought that this quote, a pen of brass, I think is pretty disparaging, really. And she thought, why does she bother to write? She should just stride and be aristocratic, which is what she does best. The writer Rebecca West was quite stinging in her criticism as well. She said of the land, there is no line of it which is feeble, but there is no line of it which has any individual beauty. Again, I think this is possibly motivated partly by jealousy at book sales, and also a sense that it was too traditional. It didn't fit with the modernist writing that was in vogue. Yet the faint praise and backhanded compliments of her friends and critics, I think, point towards some of the poem's key strengths, actually, at the same time as they portray its perceived weaknesses. For example, in relation to what Rebecca West says, that particular lines do not stand out is perhaps part of the poem's intended cumulative effect, to go back to what her son Nigel Nicholson said. In the poem's opening lines, Vita maps her ambition to write, quote, a mild, continuous epic of the soil, intended to mirror and track the temperate Kentish climate. That's me at the end, after the mild, continuous epic of the soil. So I think the poem is deliberately kind of on an even keel, and that's part of the point. I think it's kind of steady and kind of plodding, I guess, in parts, and that's sort of part of its the way in which it mirrors the changing of the seasons, and creates this kind of mild epic, which is maybe oxymoronic, of the Kent countryside. So to look a bit at sections of the poem, obviously it's a very long poem, so I've had to be somewhat selective. But I think one of the things that interests me about the land is that it resists neat categorization and labels, and it's difficult to know quite where it fits in early 20th century writing. A lot of people said, well, it's like a reimagining or a copying of Virgil's Georgics, which was a long agricultural kind of pastoral poem by Virgil. But Vita claimed never to have read Virgil's Georgics, and actually she only sort of was presented with the book halfway through writing The Land, and she couldn't read Latin, and so its influence is kind of maybe marginal. She does mention Virgil at the end, but it was only halfway through that she realised she was writing a kind of modern Georgic, so that doesn't really fit. She was called a Georgian poet, so this category of kind of writing that's wedged between the Victorian and the modernist periods, and that is characterised by its romanticism and sentimentality, although a lot of the people who were associated with it didn't quite fit that either. So D.H. Lawrence is one. I don't think it really fits entirely with the Georgian poetry label, because it's not actually that romantic in a lot of parts. So in the winter section, which is the quotation I have here, there's a very kind of de-romanticized image of nature which is presented. So I'll just read a bit of it. Here is no colour, here but form and structure, the bones of trees, the magpie bark of birches, apse of trees and tracery of network, fields of snow and tranquil trees in snow, through veils of twilight, northern, still and sad, waiting for night and for the moon, riding the sky and turning snow to beauty, pale in herself as winter's very genius, casting the shadows, delicate of trees, moon shadows, on the moonlit snow. The bare trees here are presented as kind of bone-like and skeletal, and the winter landscape, with its apse of trees, is presented by turns as a kind of spare ascetic church and an empty snow-laden moonscape. So I guess somewhat romantic, but also she's at pains to present the winter landscape as harsh. And in other parts of the poem, she talks about how it's difficult for the farmers and it's difficult for the animals in winter, and it's very much kind of a struggle. Her son Nigel Nicholson talks about the way that the poem presents humans and nature as in a state of constant conflict and collaboration. And there are lots of moments in the poem where Vita talks about the difficulties of farming this kind of chalky landscape, which we've talked about already, and the kind of it's a bit of a battle. It's often presented as a battle and having to tame nature rather than being kind of perfectly attuned with nature. So my question is, can we actually read the land as eco-poetry? Would this be a category that it fits into? I would argue that in a time of rapidly accelerating climate change, the poem's so-called out-of-touch preoccupations with nature and landscape and its determination, dogged determination to preserve fading traditions and agricultural knowledge seem to me perhaps more relevant than ever, and maybe chime with others who are now kind of categorized as ecological or have been looked through the lens of kind of eco-criticism. So Edward Thomas, for example, he's a kind of another poet who doesn't neatly fit into particular labels. The close attention to nature in the land and the changes in the landscape that take place over the course of the seasons also, I think, sort of indicate that it might fit better with this kind of eco-critical perspective. Vita was fastidious in her attempts to record this change of seasons accurately and name the different processes in plants, including less desirable things like weeds and what she calls wayside flowers. So it's not just about what's pretty in the environment, it's about the kind of forgotten, neglected elements of the landscape and the environment. She's also at pains to preserve both kind of traditions, so the kind of agricultural processes, and the language, the Kentish dialect, which kind of goes hand in hand. And she includes archaic words and often obsolete Kentish dialect in the poem, which even during her lifetime, nobody really knew what they meant anymore. But that she's kind of keen to preserve this history in relation to the landscape and the language. I think my video might not be working because my connection's a bit poor, but hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah.
I hope so.
And we've got the slides as well. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, sorry, my connection sometimes dips a bit. I'll carry on. So, for example, there's a Kentish word, undern, which actually means in the afternoon, which Vita uses in her poem. And as I say, she's keen to preserve these words as well as the kind of traditional farming practices that she describes. In parts as well, the poem moves away from, I would say, an anthropocentric viewpoint, and starts to think kind of beyond human struggles and even human time, as I'll talk about in a moment. She writes about, for example, the struggle of foxes, which have often been seen as pests, to look after their cubs in winter. And she described at one point a kind of parallel animal harvest that takes place alongside the human one, when voles and hedgehogs collect and store food in late summer. The poem's attitude to time also moves away from the anthropocentric, I think. Human time and the farming year are viewed in the context of larger cycles that do not always correspond to an imposed calendar. So she talks about the farmer or the gardener having to do certain things based on kind of what's happening with the weather and the climate, and whether spring is on time or whether it's late, as it is this year in fact, rather than doing tasks and processes according to kind of fixed calendar, which is ultimately imposed on the kind of time and the natural landscape, which does what it wants to do at the end of the day, really. So I'm nearly at an end here. So I won't read this whole last section, but towards the end of the poem, we get to autumn. That's the last season that she deals with. And I guess this fits quite well with what we were talking about in relation to deep time again, but I think the poem engages with what I'm calling ecological time. So time in the poem is viewed as non-linear and often multi-layered, which actually fits pretty well with some of the modernist figures who said that, you know, her work didn't fit with what they were doing. It doesn't fit neatly, but actually in its attitude to time, I think it is multi-layered and it is non-linear, particularly in relation to nature. So towards the end of this last section of the poem Autumn, Vita demonstrates her concern with time, and particularly with threshold moments. So she thinks about autumn as a threshold moment, and being close in a way, closer to spring than it is to other seasons, because of both of those seasons being kind of beginnings and a beginning and an ending. Here in this last section on my slide in the second column, past preparation and forward planning overlap and intermingle in the form of, quote, retrospect and prospect. The poet describes autumn as, quote, like the Janus of the year, summoning the image of the Roman god Janus, who presides over beginnings, endings, and transitions, and of course is often thought about as two-faced. Autumn is linked to spring, quote, in double-handed keeping, end quote, showing the parallels between these two threshold transitional seasons, with spring sleeping as, quote, in the room, and as it ripens to its bloom. So this moment at the end of the poem links spring and autumn in a way which kind of layers time. And here, as elsewhere, the poem deals with seemingly conventional themes in ways that are often, I think, unconventional, detailed, sometimes monotonous, but often startling. This was a form and tone deliberately and carefully tuned and calibrated to the Kentish rhythms and landscape that Vita Sackville-West so loved. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I'm loving what's coming over with time. I love the idea of ecological time to add to deep time, and the idea of the temporary and the temporal.